in the heart of ancient China, during the twilight of the Zhou Dynasty. A kingdom teetered on the brink of ruin. It was an era marked by both grandeur and decadence, where power was held by a king who seemed destined for greatness but whose reign would eventually be remembered for its corruption and cruelty. His name was King Zhou, also known as Tru, a monarch whose rule began with the promise of strength but ended in the chaos of a crumbling dynasty. The year was 1046 BCE, and the Zhou Dynasty had ruled for centuries, leaving a legacy of military victories and cultural advances. But behind the glittering facade of prosperity, the people of Zhou were beginning to feel the heavy hand of a tyrant. King Zhou, once a capable ruler, had begun to indulge in excess, becoming more detached from the struggles of his people. His courts were filled with luxury, but the kingdom was filled with unrest. His advisors and generals, once trusted, began to turn against him, whispering about his decisions, fearing that the king was losing his grip on reality. And then, into this fractured world, a woman named Daji entered. She was not just another beauty from a prominent family. She was a force in her own right. Tales of her charm, her intelligence, and her incredible beauty spread far and wide, reaching the ears of the king. Daji was chosen to be his consort, a decision that would ultimately alter the course of history. At first glance, Daji appeared to be the perfect wife for a king in search of solace and strength. But beneath her enchanting exterior, there lurked a darker ambition. As King Zhou grew more entranced by her beauty, he slowly allowed her influence to creep into every corner of his rule. With each passing day, Daji's presence at court grew more dominant, and it wasn't long before the king, whose decisions had once been guided by reason and counsel, began to make choices that defied logic, leading his empire down a path from which there would be no return. Daji, the woman who was once the epitome of grace, would soon become the catalyst for a reign of terror, her name synonymous with the corruption of power and the fall of an entire dynasty. But how did a single woman, with no real claim to the throne, come to wield such incredible influence over one of the most powerful kings in ancient China? This is the story of Daji, the wife of King Zhou, whose beauty and cunning turned the wheel of fate, leading the Zhou Dynasty to its tragic collapse. The Zhou Dynasty had ruled over China for more than 5 centuries, but by the time King Zhou ascended the throne, the empire was already showing signs of disintegration. The once mighty kingdom, founded on the strength of its warriors and the wisdom of its rulers, was now plagued by internal strife and external threats. Yet, despite these challenges, the early years of King Zhou's reign seemed promising. The young king was initially seen as a capable ruler, one who sought to build upon the legacy of his ancestors, ensuring prosperity for his people and peace with neighboring states. King Zhou, born as Gfa, was the son of King I of Zhou. He had been raised in the halls of power, trained in the arts of war and governance. His early successes on the battlefield won him respect from his generals, and his sharp mind earned him the loyalty of his ministers. It was said that he ruled with a sense of justice, and his subjects praised his ability to manage the affairs of the state with a steady hand. But as the years passed, the pressures of ruling such a vast and complex kingdom began to take their toll. The more King Zhou focused on the grandeur of his court and the lavish pleasures of his position, the more detached he became from the lives of his people. What had once been a ruler focused on the welfare of his citizens began to shift into a monarch obsessed with luxury and indulgence. His court, once a place of order and dignity, became a den of excess, where only the most extravagant pleasures were sought. The people began to whisper of his growing arrogance, of his increasing reliance on sycophants, and of his neglect of the vital issues that plagued the kingdom. In the midst of this changing atmosphere, there entered a woman whose beauty and allure would become the focus of King Zhou's attention. Her name was Daji. Daji was not from a family of noble blood, but her rise to prominence seemed almost fated. Her father, a minor noble, had been influential in the courts of the Shang, though he had never held any significant power. Daji, however, possessed an unusual combination of beauty and intelligence that made her stand out even in the most distinguished circles. It was said that she was a woman of great charm, with a grace that captivated all who came near her. Her presence in any room was enough to silence conversation, and her smile could light up the darkest of corners. Her beauty alone might have earned her a place in the royal court, but it was her sharp mind and cunning nature that ultimately caught the eye of King Zhou. When she first appeared before him, she was little more than a court beauty, just one among many women vying for the king's attention. But Daji was different. She had a rare quality that made her stand out from the others. She did not simply seek to please the king through her charm. Instead, she offered him something far more valuable, a kind of companionship that he had long been missing. First, King Zhou was taken in by Daji's beauty and charm, as any man would be, but it wasn't long before he began to see in her something far more dangerous, a woman with an ambition as boundless as his own. Daji did not simply want to be the king's favorite consort. She wanted to be his confidant, his advisor, his most trusted ally, and, in time, she would get her wish. As King Zhou became increasingly enamored with Daji, he began to rely more and more on her counsel. She was present at every major decision, every important event, her words shaping the policies and actions of the kingdom. In the beginning, the king was still a man of reason, but the more he listened to Daji, the more he began to lean into his desires, ignoring the counsel of his more experienced advisors. Daji, with her soft words and knowing glances, began to weave a web of influence around him, pulling the strings of power from behind the scenes. Her influence over King Zhou grew with every passing day, and the king became more and more consumed by her presence. He began to trust her above all others, and soon, no decision was made without her approval. It was said that he became a mere puppet in her hands, a man whose will was no longer his own but hers to command. With Daji's influence growing, the court of King Zhou began to change. Once a place of deliberation and careful decision-making, it became a playground for the king's excesses. His ministers and generals, who had once guided him with wisdom and caution, were gradually pushed aside. They were replaced by sycophants, those who knew how to please the king with extravagant gifts and flattery. Daji herself began to play a key role in this new order, using her position to remove those who opposed her rise and to place her allies in positions of power. The Shang Dynasty, once a beacon of strength and stability, began to erode from within. The king, intoxicated by his power and his obsession with Daji, paid little attention to the growing discontent among the people. The kingdom that had once been the envy of its neighbors was now on the brink of collapse, and its ruler, King Zhou, was too blinded by his love for Daji to see the disaster that was unfolding. But Daji, in her relentless pursuit of power, was not content with simply holding the king's favor. She sought to mold him in her image, to turn him into a ruler who would bend to her will completely. And so, she began to influence him in ways that would have long-lasting consequences, not just for the king but for the entire kingdom. As the story of King Zhou and Daji unfolds, the seeds of a tragic destiny are sown, setting in motion a series of events that will change the course of Chinese history forever. Toi si tip tuc voi fan tu qua ka chuyen. Tai nin. Du gioi han vi du dai trong mot lon traloi. Toi si chia fan nai ton kak don no de ju tin lin tuc trong ka chuyen. De la fan tip theo qua ka chuyen vi Daji va on hung qua ko doi voi King Zhou. As the years passed, King Zhou's reign became increasingly defined by his love for Daji. Her influence over him was subtle at first, but it grew stronger with every passing day. What had once been a relationship built on affection and admiration slowly transformed into one of manipulation and control. Daji, no longer content with simply being the king's favorite consort, began to weave her web of power within the royal court. The once proud halls of the Shang court, filled with grand debates and political strategies, now echoed with the whispers of sycophants and opportunists. King Zhou, consumed by his obsession with Daji, paid little heed to the concerns of his ministers, generals, and the wise counselors who had once guided him. His judgment, once sharp and measured, grew clouded, and he began to rely almost exclusively on Daji's counsel, a counsel that was increasingly colored by her own ambitions. Daji's rise to power was not an accident. It was a calculated move. She understood that power was not simply a matter of winning the king's favor but of isolating him from the voices of reason that surrounded him. She sought to undermine the very foundation of the Shang court's governance, slowly replacing the men who had once served King Zhou with those who were loyal only to her. These men, many of whom were chosen for their ability to flatter and cater to the king's every whim, were in turn used to further her own agenda. First, King Zhou's advisors took little notice of the changes. They saw Daji's growing influence as nothing more than the king's personal affair. But as the months turned into years, it became clear that her influence was not confined to the bedroom or the social circles of the court. Daji was deeply involved in the king's decision-making process, often advising him on matters of state with an authority that seemed to rival that of his most experienced ministers. It was as though the king could no longer make a decision without consulting her first. Daji's counsel, however, was not one of wisdom or sound judgment. Rather, it was marked by cruelty, greed, and a ruthless desire for control. Where King Zhou had once been a ruler who sought justice and peace, Daji pushed him towards policies of tyranny and excess. Her voice, soft and insistent, whispered in his ear, convincing him that the only way to maintain power was through fear and absolute control. She advised him to punish those who opposed him, to silence those who spoke out, and to reward those who kowtowed to his every command. Under Daji's influence, King Zhou's rule grew increasingly despotic. The court, once a place of lively debate and careful diplomacy, became a chamber of fear. Those who once spoke freely of their ideas were now silent, too afraid to oppose the king's increasingly erratic decisions. Daji, who had once been the beautiful consort, became a figure of terror in her own right. Her beauty, once her greatest asset, now seemed to pale in comparison to the cold, calculating power she wielded. King Zhou, blind to the damage he was causing, became more and more dependent on Daji. He no longer trusted the counsel of his generals or his advisors, many of whom had served the Shang dynasty loyally for years. Daji, ever the manipulator, played on his insecurities, convincing him that only she could be trusted, that only her advice would lead him to greatness. In this way, she slowly and methodically isolated him from the world around him. One of the first signs of the growing influence of Daji came in the form of Gong, a minister who had long been a trusted advisor to King Zhou. Gong, once a man of great wisdom and honor, had seen firsthand the changes in the king. He had noticed how King Zhou's once keen mind had grown dull and erratic, how the king had become increasingly isolated from his people. Gong, who had always been a staunch advocate for the welfare of the kingdom, began to speak out against the king's policies, warning him of the dangers of excessive indulgence and cruelty. It was then that Daji intervened, with a smile that concealed her true intentions. She suggested to the king that Gong was a threat to his rule. She painted him as a disloyal minister, someone who sought to undermine the king's authority. King Zhou, his judgment clouded by his obsession with Daji, took her words to heart. Gong, once a trusted servant of the throne, was soon executed under charges of treason, a victim of Daji's manipulations. The execution of Gong marked a turning point in King Zhou's reign. It was a sign to the rest of the court that dissent would no longer be tolerated, that the king would no longer listen to those who offered wise counsel. The fear that now gripped the court was palpable. Those who had once spoken freely of their opinions now whispered in hushed tones, afraid to say anything that might anger the king or Daji. Daji's influence continued to grow. She had succeeded in isolating King Zhou from the world around him, convincing him that only she could be trusted to guide him. But she was not content to simply control the king's decisions. She also sought to control the very fabric of Shang society. One of the most shocking changes she introduced was the use of torture as a means of maintaining control. Daji, with her keen understanding of the human psyche, knew that fear was the most effective tool for keeping the people in line. She convinced King Zhou that the only way to ensure loyalty from his subjects was through terror. Under her influence, the king ordered the creation of a system of punishment that was both brutal and public. Those who were seen as enemies of the throne were subjected to horrific tortures. Their suffering meant to serve as a warning to anyone who might dare to oppose the king's rule. The tortures were unspeakable. People were whipped, beaten, and burned, their screams echoing through the streets of the capital. Public executions became a regular occurrence, and the very sight of them struck fear into the hearts of the people. The once vibrant and prosperous capital of Shang became a place of death and suffering, where no one was safe from the wrath of the king and his wife. King Zhou, however, was not the only one who was changing under Daji's influence. She, too, was transforming. The woman who had once been the charming consort, the beauty who captured the king's heart, was becoming something far darker. She no longer cared about the people of Shang, nor did she care about the legacy of the dynasty. All that mattered to Daji was power, her own power, and her ability to bend the kingdom to her will. The love she once had for King Zhou seemed to fade as she grew more consumed by her ambition. As the years passed, the kingdom that had once stood strong began to crumble. The people, crushed under the weight of tyranny and fear, began to lose their faith in the throne. Rebellions began to simmer in the outskirts of the kingdom, and rumors spread that neighboring states were preparing to strike. But Daji, blinded by her power, saw only the glory of her own ascent. She no longer saw the kingdom as something worth preserving. Instead, she saw it as a tool for her own personal gain. And so, as the kingdom descended further into chaos, Daji continued to pull the strings, guiding King Zhou ever deeper into darkness. But the question remained: how long could a kingdom built on fear and cruelty survive? How long could a king and his queen sustain a reign based not on wisdom or justice, but on manipulation and terror? As Daji's influence over King Zhou grew, so did her resolve to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of her absolute control. The once strong and trusted officials of the Shang court, who had dedicated their lives to the prosperity of the kingdom, found themselves cast aside or, worse, sent to their deaths. Loyalty to the throne had come to mean nothing. What mattered now was loyalty to Daji, for she held the king's ear and his heart in a way no one else could. The first to feel the sting of Daji's wrath was Zhou, one of King Zhou's most respected generals. Zhou had served with distinction in several military campaigns, earning the admiration of both the king and the people. His strategies on the battlefield were seen as the key to the Shang dynasty's continued dominance in China. But as Daji's influence grew, the general began to voice his concerns over the increasingly erratic behavior of the king. He feared that King Zhou's obsession with luxury and cruelty was eroding the kingdom's stability. Zhou even spoke openly of his concerns to the king, urging him to return to the righteous rule that had once characterized the Shang dynasty. Daji, upon hearing of Zhuansu's warnings, knew that he was a threat to her growing power. She could not afford to allow a man of his standing to undermine her influence over King Zhou. Using her manipulative charm, she whispered into the king's ear, convincing him that Zhuansu's loyalties were no longer aligned with the throne. She painted him as a conspirator, a man who sought to replace King Zhou with someone more aligned with the old ways, a threat to the king's authority. King Zhou, already vulnerable to Daji's manipulations, believed her words. In a tragic turn of events, Zhuansu was accused of treason and executed. His body was left to rot in the public square as a grim reminder of what happened to those who dared to speak against the king or his queen. The death of Zhuansu sent shockwaves through the court, It was a stark message to all who served under King Zhou. Loyalty was no longer measured by service to the throne, but by service to Daji. And as the loyalists fell one by one, a new breed of courtier emerged, those who had no allegiance to the kingdom, only to the whims of the queen. In the wake of Zhuan Su's execution, the Shang dynasty began to lose its grip on power. The generals who had once held the loyalty of their troops now cowered before the queen's cruelty. Gao Xian, a respected military leader, tried to remain neutral, but his silence on matters of the court did not shield him from Daji's suspicions. She saw him as weak, another man who refused to take a stand. Daji worked her influence again, coaxing King Zhou into believing that Gao Xian's reluctance to act was a sign of disloyalty. Once again, the king's mind was clouded by Daji's manipulations, and Gao Xian was stripped of his title and thrown into the dungeons. But it was not just the generals who fell prey to Daji's ruthless designs. The ministers, who had long been the backbone of the Shang court, also began to disappear. Wang Jin, the chief strategist, who had advised King Zhou on matters of statecraft, was accused of mismanaging the royal treasury. Daji, ever cunning, spun the tale that Wang Jin had been secretly hoarding wealth to fund a rebellion. With no one to defend him and the king's trust now entirely in her hands, Wang Jin was executed without trial, his wealth seized, and his family exiled, with the most loyal figures in the court now removed or eliminated. Daji moved to solidify her control over every aspect of the kingdom. She began to hand out positions of power to her allies, men who had no real qualifications, but who owed everything to her favor. These men, who had no interest in the welfare of the Shang dynasty, were only concerned with their own advancement. They carried out Daji's orders without question, making decisions that further fueled the growing unrest among the people of Shang, who had once looked up to their rulers as protectors, now saw them as tyrants. Under Daji's influence, King Zhou had become a puppet, his every action dictated by her desires. The once great dynasty, known for its strength and culture, had been reduced to a kingdom of fear and violence. Yet, it was not only the court that suffered under Daji's reign. The land itself began to wither as the king and queen focused on their own personal pleasures rather than the kingdom's needs. Even as the court was purged of its loyalists, the whispers of rebellion began to spread throughout the kingdom. The once mighty Shang military, crippled by Daji's manipulations, was now ineffective. Discontent grew in the provinces, where governors and local officials who had once supported the throne now saw the king as a figurehead, a man who had been thoroughly corrupted by his queen. The cities, once prosperous, now lay in ruin. Tax burdens on the peasantry increased as King Zhou, under Daji's direction, sought to fund ever more extravagant projects, including the construction of massive palaces and the hosting of elaborate feasts. At the same time, Daji's cruelty grew more pronounced. She ordered the torture of those who dared to speak out against the court, and public executions became a daily occurrence. The people of Shang, living in constant fear, had no choice but to submit to the queen's will. Those who resisted were swiftly silenced, their fates sealed by the very hands that had once promised to protect them. But despite the fear that gripped the kingdom, there were those who still held hope for the future. A rebellion, led by King Wu of the Zhou, began to take shape. The Zhou people, who had long been oppressed by the Shang, saw an opportunity to overthrow the corrupt dynasty and restore justice to the land. King Wu, a man of vision and strength, had been quietly building support among the military and the common folk, waiting for the right moment to strike. The time was fast approaching. Yet, for Daji, this growing opposition was little more than a distant threat. She had become consumed by her power. Convinced that her rule was invincible, she continued to manipulate King Zhou, pushing him further into the abyss of tyranny. Even as the world around them began to collapse, she believed that she had secured her place in history, that nothing could tear down the empire she had helped build. But in her arrogance, She failed to see the storm that was brewing on the horizon. The loyalists, the men and women who had once fought for the Shang, were no longer there to defend the kingdom. They had been replaced by those who served only to gratify the whims of the queen. The foundations of the dynasty had been hollowed out, and soon, the entire empire would begin to crumble. And so, as Daji reveled in her power, she failed to realize the inevitable truth that every empire built on cruelty and fear will eventually fall. As the Shang dynasty's grip on power weakened, King Zhou and Daji found themselves increasingly isolated from the forces that had once sustained their rule. Their influence, once vast and unchallenged, now extended only to the walls of the royal palace, where the last remnants of their power were tightly controlled. The court, a once vibrant and bustling center of culture and governance, had become a shell of its former self, a place where only sycophants dared to speak and the will of the people had no voice. Daji, in her desire to secure her hold on the throne, had begun to grow paranoid. Though she had removed all of King Zhou's former allies and filled the court with her own loyalists, the whispers of rebellion continued to haunt her. The people of the empire had grown restless, their grievances reaching the ears of the faraway provinces. The weight of the king's cruel policies, combined with Daji's insidious manipulations, had pushed the masses to the brink of revolt. What had once been an empire of strength and order was now an empire of fear and suffering. But even as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Daji and King Zhou remained locked in a web of power, their eyes fixed on the world inside the palace. King Zhou, now a hollow shell of the man he had once been, clung to Daji's influence. His mind, clouded by years of indulgence and tyranny, had become fragile. He had abandoned all semblance of reason, instead choosing to trust Daji implicitly, believing her every word, no matter how twisted. His reign was now defined by excess and cruelty, and he no longer cared about the welfare of his kingdom. Daji, too, had become a prisoner of her own ambitions. Her beauty and charm, once enough to captivate the king's heart, had now given way to something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating hunger for power that consumed her every thought. She had long since stopped caring for the people of Shang. They were nothing more than pawns in her grand scheme to solidify her position as the queen of the empire. She had made her mark on history, she believed, and nothing would stand in her way. Yet, even as the two of them grew more entrenched in their own desires, a whisper of hope began to stir in the hearts of the people. Started small, a murmur here, a whisper there, but soon, it became clear that something had shifted in the air. In the provinces, the anger that had been building for years began to boil over. The people, oppressed by the king's tyranny and the queen's cruelty, began to rise up, rejecting the Shang dynasty and all it stood for. At the heart of this rebellion stood King Wu of the Zhou, a man who had long held ambitions to overthrow the Shang. His family, once subjugated by the Shang rulers, had never forgotten the oppression they had suffered. And now, in King Wu, the Zhou saw a leader capable of leading them to victory. King Wu's cause was simple: to free the people from the yoke of tyranny and restore justice to the land. But for all his vision and strength, King Wu knew that defeating the Shang would not be easy. The Shang army, though weakened, was still formidable, and King Zhou's court was filled with men and women who would fight to the death to preserve the empire. For King Wu, the key to success lay not in brute force, but in the support of the people. He spent months building alliances, rallying the discontented peasants and the marginalized members of society to his side. He spoke of a new dawn for China, one in which the people would be free from the fear that had defined the Shang dynasty. And as his influence spread, so did the hope of the people. The moment of reckoning came when King Wu finally mustered enough support to march on the capital. The rebellion had gained enough momentum, and the people, who had long suffered under the reign of terror, were now ready to fight for their freedom. King Wu's army, a blend of well-trained soldiers and passionate volunteers, began their march towards the royal palace. their hearts filled with the hope of a better future. At the same time, in the capital, Daji was preparing for the celebration of the Fengyi Feast, an event she had organized to mark yet another year of King Zhou's reign. It was to be a grand spectacle, an extravaganza of luxury and indulgence, where the nobility would gather to feast and revel in excess. Daji, ever obsessed with maintaining her grip on power, saw the feast as an opportunity to further solidify her control. She believed that by surrounding herself with the most powerful and influential men and women of the court, she could prove to the people that her reign was unchallenged, that her position as queen was secure. Little did she know, however, that the celebration would be the final moment of her rule. The day of the feast arrived, and the palace was filled with laughter and music. The tables were laden with delicacies. The wine flowed freely, and the nobility celebrated as if they were unaware of the growing storm outside the city walls. King Zhou, sitting at the head of the table, peered distant, his eyes glazed over as he indulged in the pleasures of the night. Daji, seated by his side, smiled at her guests, playing the role of the gracious queen. To the courtiers, it was a night of opulence and grandeur, a reminder of the power they still wielded. But outside, the rebellion was gaining momentum. King Wu's army had reached the gates of the capital, and the battle for the future of the Zhou Dynasty was about to begin. As King Wu's forces surrounded the city, Daji and King Zhou remained oblivious to the growing threat. Daji, secure in her belief that nothing could bring down her reign, refused to believe that the rebellion would succeed. She ordered the palace guards to bolster the defenses, but her efforts were in vain. The army of the Zhou was too strong, their resolve too firm. In the midst of the revelry, news of the rebellion reached the royal court. A messenger, breathless and frantic, burst into the feast, delivering the grim news that the gates of the capital had been breached. Daji, startled by the news, turned to King Zhou for reassurance. But the king, lost in his delusions, did not respond. He sat there, his mind clouded by years of indulgence, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the situation. Panic began to spread through the court. The once proud warriors of the Zhou were now filled with fear, realizing that their time had come. They had served King Zhou and Daji faithfully for years, but now they saw that their loyalty had been misplaced. The Zhou rebellion was not just a political movement, it was a cry for freedom from tyranny. And as the enemy forces closed in, the walls of the royal palace began to tremble. Daji, now frantic and desperate, tried to rally the court to action. But it was too late. The Zhou forces, led by King Wu, stormed the palace gates, and the battle for the throne began. The night of the Fengyi Feast, once intended to showcase the invincibility of the Zhou Dynasty, became the night the dynasty's fate was sealed, as the Zhou forces, emboldened by the cries of the oppressed, advanced through the capital. The palace's once proud walls were shaken by the thundering footsteps of revolution. The festivity, filled with laughter and wine, was replaced by the blood-curdling sounds of battle just beyond the gates. The court, so sure of its power, was now engulfed in panic. Those who had once lived in the luxury of King Zhou's favor now faced the stark reality that the foundation of their rule was crumbling. Inside the palace, King Zhou's mind, clouded by years of indulgence, refused to confront the storm that was battering the gates. He sat at the head of the table, unable to process the urgency of the moment. His body was there, but his thoughts were far away, lost in the haze of his desires. Daji, ever the manipulator, tried to keep her composure, yet her usual confidence faltered. The queen, who had once controlled the court with an iron grip, found herself faced with an enemy far more dangerous than any political rival, time itself, and the wrath of a kingdom that had endured far too much. "Your Majesty," one of her advisors urgently called, "the Zhou army is at the gates. They are too strong. We must prepare to defend the city." Daji turned to the king, her face pale with fear for the first time in years. "King Zhou," who had never shown true strength, stared back at her with empty eyes, as if he could not fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. "We cannot surrender, my love," Daji whispered to him, her voice trembling with a rare crack of vulnerability. "We must hold on to what we have left." But even as she spoke, she knew that the battle was already lost. The Zhou's forces had infiltrated the city, their resolve unshakable. Their victory had become inevitable, and the collapse of the Shang dynasty was now a question of when, not if. Outside the palace, King Wu's forces were relentless. They had been building momentum for years, slowly gathering the strength to challenge the cruel rule of the Shang. The rebellion was not simply a political struggle. It was a battle for justice, for the freedom of a people who had suffered under the yoke of King Zhou's tyranny. The oppressed had risen up, and now they were about to claim their victory. King Wu's army, though smaller in numbers, was motivated by a singular purpose, led by a man who embodied honor and strength. They had marched on the capital with a determination to end the reign of terror that had plagued the land for so long. His generals, battle-hardened and loyal, led their troops with precision, striking fear into the hearts of the Shang defenders. Inside the palace, panic began to spread like wildfire. The once proud guards, loyal to King Zhou and Daji, now questioned their allegiances. They had been serving a king who had long lost his sense of purpose, and a queen who had destroyed the very soul of the empire. The time had come for them to choose: fight for a corrupt dynasty that had lost its way, or stand with the rising forces of justice. Among the courtiers, there were those who began to slip away, seeking refuge with the advancing Zhou forces. Some believed it was too late to salvage their loyalties to the Shang, while others had simply been worn down by years of cruelty and injustice. The streets, once filled with wealth and extravagance, were now a battleground. The sounds of the Zhou army clashing with the royal defenders echoed through the capital, as the last remnants of the Shang dynasty made their final stand. Despite her best efforts, Daji was losing control of the palace. As the hours passed, the Shang forces grew more desperate. Even the palace's luxurious walls, once impenetrable, had been breached. The throne room, which had once been a symbol of King Zhou's power, was now under siege. The once beautiful tapestries that adorned the walls hung tattered and torn. The gilded chandeliers that had illuminated the feasts of the elite now cast shadows on the faces of the broken courtiers who were fleeing for their lives. Daji, once the queen of Shang, now found herself in a desperate flight. She turned to the king, her eyes wild with panic. "We must leave," she urged him. "The people are coming for us. There is no escape here." King Zhou, his mind fractured and incapable of rational thought, barely reacted. His eyes were fixed on the chaos around him, but his heart seemed to have long since abandoned the idea of escape or survival. He had surrendered to the inevitable. Daji, realizing that there was no longer any hope of keeping the dynasty intact, ordered her guards to escort the king to the royal chambers in an attempt to hide him from the advancing army. But King Wu's forces were already closing in. Their numbers had swelled, and the scent of victory was in the air. The rebellion had reached the heart of the palace, and the people who had suffered under the Shang now stood at its gates, ready to reclaim their future. As Daji and King Zhou attempted to flee, the walls that had once protected them now seemed to mock their impotence. It was clear now, the end was near. In the midst of this chaos, King Wu led his forces directly into the palace. His army, moving with the precision and discipline of men who knew what was at stake, quickly overwhelmed the remaining defenders. King Wu, upon reaching the throne room, entered the space where the once great King Zhou had ruled. The sight of the fallen king and queen, broken and powerless, was the final testament to the rise and fall of the Shang. "Your reign has ended," King Wu declared, his voice carrying the weight of history. He stepped forward and placed his sword on the ground before the defeated King Zhou. "The people will no longer live in fear." King Zhou, defeated and humiliated, barely acknowledged the words. He sat slumped on the throne, his gaze distant and hollow. Daji, ever the manipulator, sought to negotiate, to find a way to escape the consequences of her actions. But there would be no mercy for her or for the king. The people had suffered too long. The Zhou forces, with the blessing of the people, executed the final chapter of the Shang dynasty. King Zhou was stripped of his royal robes, his wealth, and his title, reduced to nothing more than a prisoner of the rebellion. Daji, too, was captured. Her beauty and cunning, which had once been her greatest assets, were now her downfall. She was taken from the palace, humiliated, and led through the streets of the capital in front of the very people she had oppressed. Her fate, sealed by her own cruelty, was a grim reminder of the cost of unchecked power. The once glorious queen, who had held sway over the might of the Shang dynasty, now became a symbol of the tyranny the Zhou had fought to overthrow. The fall of the Shang dynasty marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new chapter in China's long and tumultuous history. King Zhou and Daji, the once untouchable rulers, were now prisoners of the very people they had once ruled with cruelty and indifference. The streets of the capital, which had once echoed with the sound of the king's laughter and the clinking of wine goblets, were now filled with the cries of triumph from the Zhou forces. But beneath this victory, there was an undeniable cost, a price that would haunt the land for generations. King Wu, the leader of the Zhou rebellion, had achieved his long-sought goal, the overthrow of the Shang. With his forces now in control of the capital, he immediately began the task of dismantling the remnants of the Shang dynasty. His soldiers, battle-worn but victorious, set to work seizing the royal treasury and redistributing wealth to the people. The symbols of Shang power, the golden chariots, the priceless artifacts, and the monumental palaces were torn down, their glory fading into the dust. The very infrastructure that had once sustained the empire was now dismantled, and the people began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. For King Wu, however, the task was not merely to destroy the old regime. He knew that the true work of governance lay in the creation of a just and prosperous new order. He gathered his closest advisors and military leaders, formulating a plan to establish a new kingdom based on principles of fairness and justice. The Zhou were no longer merely a rebellious people. They were now the foundation of a new dynasty, one that would stand in stark contrast to the cruelty and excesses of the Shang. As for King Zhou and Daji, their fates were sealed. They had lost everything, their power, their wealth, their kingdom. They were now prisoners, their lives hanging in the balance. King Wu, although determined to bring justice to the land, did not immediately order their executions. Instead, he sought to make an example of them, to show the people the cost of tyranny. It was a decision that would echo through history, for the way they were treated would symbolize the end of an era of oppression. King Zhou, broken and humiliated, was forced to live in the most degrading conditions. Once a ruler, he was now a prisoner of the very people he had oppressed. His once proud appearance had withered into that of a man defeated by his own excesses. His once gilded robes were now replaced by tattered rags. He was no longer the powerful king, surrounded by advisors and courtiers. Instead, he was a man without honor, shackled in a dim, cold cell. Daji, too, met a similar fate. Once celebrated for her beauty, intelligence, and cunning, she was now a shadow of her former self. Her power, which had been so absolute during the reign of the Shang, had crumbled. The once proud queen, who had manipulated her husband and court to do her bidding, was now a prisoner, held in the same dungeons as the defeated king. But even in her captivity, Daji remained unrepentant, her mind still whirling with plans to regain her former glory. She believed, deep down, that she could somehow manipulate the situation in her favor once again, that she could charm her way back into power. But the people were no longer fooled by her beauty or her lies. As the days passed, rumors spread about the fate of the fallen king and queen. the people of the capital, long oppressed by their cruelty, celebrated in the streets. But the higher echelons of the court were divided. Some believed that King Wu should show mercy, for even a tyrant like King Zhou had once been a king of the people. Others, however, felt that the punishment must be swift and severe, that the final humiliation of the Shang rulers would be the only way to ensure that such a reign of terror would never be repeated. It was Tai Gong Wang, the legendary strategist who had helped King Wu in the rebellion, who ultimately decided the fate of King Zhou and Daji. A man of wisdom, Tai Gong Wang believed that to kill them would only perpetuate the cycle of bloodshed. Instead, he advised King Wu to make their downfall a public spectacle, an act that would serve as a reminder to the people of the dangers of unchecked power. And so, King Zhou and Daji were paraded through the streets of the capital. Once treated as gods among men, they were now reduced to mere prisoners, their faces etched with the marks of their cruelty and decadence. The people watched with a mix of triumph and bitterness, for their suffering had not been forgotten. As they were led through the streets, their eyes downcast, the crowd jeered. The public spectacle was a moment of catharsis for the people, a symbolic cleansing of the corruption that had stained the kingdom for so long. Daji, ever defiant, attempted to maintain her dignity, but it was clear to everyone that her reign had come to an ignoble end. King Zhou, broken and lost, remained silent, his eyes hollow with regret. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had once ordered the most horrific punishments now found himself the object of public scorn. The woman who had once controlled the entire court now begged for mercy, her beauty fading like a flower wilting in the harsh light of truth. Their journey through the streets was a slow march toward their execution. The decision had been made. King Zhou and Daji were to be executed publicly, and the people would bear witness to the end of a dynasty built on cruelty. It was a death long overdue, a symbolic moment of justice for the people who had endured so much. Daji's final moments were filled with the same manipulative cunning that had defined her reign. She attempted to beg for her life, pleading with the people, trying to twist their emotions in her favor. But the people had seen enough. They were no longer swayed by her beauty or her promises. King Zhou, too, was no longer seen as a king, but as a symbol of the dangers of absolute power. They were executed, their bodies displayed for all to see. The execution was swift, a final statement that tyranny would not be tolerated in the new kingdom of the Zhou. As their bodies were removed from public view, a sense of finality swept through the capital. The long reign of the Shang Dynasty had come to an end, and with it, a new era began. King Wu and the Zhou people began the process of rebuilding. They sought to create a society based on virtue, justice, and the will of the people. King Wu, though victorious, was mindful of the lessons learned from the fall of the Shang. He knew that the same arrogance that had led to the downfall of King Zhou and Daji could one day threaten his own reign. But for now, the people rejoiced. The chains of oppression had been broken, and the sun of a new era had risen. With the fall of the Shang Dynasty and the public execution of King Zhou and Daji, the reign of terror that had haunted the land for so long was finally brought to an end. The streets of the capital, once filled with the arrogance and opulence of the Shang court, now buzzed with the fervor of a people who had been freed from the yoke of tyranny. Yet, as the dust of battle settled and the ashes of the Shang were swept away, a new order began to take shape. The Zhou Dynasty, founded upon ideals of justice, virtue, and the will of the people, had come to power. But the question remained, would the Zhou be able to fulfill the promise of a better future? Or would they, too, succumb to the same forces of corruption and excess that had led to the fall of the Shang? King Wu, now the undisputed ruler of China, stood at the precipice of history. His victory over the Shang was not just a military triumph, it was a symbolic moment of change, a turning of the tide. The Zhou army, though weary from years of rebellion, was filled with optimism and hope. Their cause had been just, their struggle noble, and now they were tasked with rebuilding a fractured empire. the challenges were immense. The land had been ravaged by war, the economy in tatters, and the people, though free from the terror of the Shang, were still deeply scarred. The Zhou, in their quest for justice, knew that they could not simply return to the ways of the old regime. They would have to create something new, a system of governance that would ensure that the mistakes of the Shang would never be repeated. To accomplish this, King Wu called upon the counsel of his most trusted advisors. At the forefront of these advisors was Tai Gongwang, the legendary strategist who had played a pivotal role in the Zhou victory. A man of wisdom and foresight, Tai Gongwang was determined to lay the foundation for a just and lasting dynasty. He understood that the key to lasting peace and prosperity lay not just in military conquest, but in the establishment of a fair and effective system of governance. He urged King Wu to create a society that would be built on the principles of merit, loyalty, and the collective good. But Tai Gongwang also knew that the wounds of the past would take time to heal. The people of China had been through generations of suffering. Under the brutal rule of the Shang, the horrors they had endured would not be forgotten easily. King Wu's reign, though celebrated by many, was still met with skepticism by some who had lived through the worst excesses of the Shang. There were those who feared that the Zhou, once in power, would become just as corrupt as their predecessors. King Wu understood this fear, and he knew that the only way to ensure his dynasty's success was to prove, through his actions, that the Zhou would rule differently. The first step in the Zhou's new order was to re-establish the mandate of heaven, a concept that would become central to Chinese political philosophy for centuries to come. According to this belief, the ruling dynasty was chosen by the heavens, and its legitimacy depended on its ability to rule justly and wisely. If a dynasty became corrupt or failed to uphold moral principles, the mandate would be withdrawn, and another dynasty would rise to take its place. By asserting that the Zhou had received the mandate of heaven, King Wu sought to legitimize his rule and present it as the will of the cosmos. He had overthrown the Shang, but now he had to prove that he was worthy of the mandate. Yet, while King Wu worked to solidify his reign, there was still much work to be done. His forces, though victorious, were scattered, and the administrative structures of the old Shang dynasty had been dismantled. The Zhou needed to restore order and stability to the land, and that required more than just military might. It required a vision for the future. One of King Wu's first acts as ruler was to implement a system of feudalism, a structure that would decentralize power and place local rulers in charge of various regions of the kingdom. The idea was to create a system where loyalty to the central government would be reinforced by local leaders who had a personal stake in the success of the dynasty. These local lords would govern the land in exchange for military service and tribute, and they would be responsible for ensuring the well-being of their people. This feudal system would go on to become one of the key features of the Zhou dynasty, and it would play a critical role in shaping Chinese governance for centuries to come. But it was also a system fraught with potential dangers. While feudalism could provide stability by promoting loyalty to the central government, it also gave local lords significant autonomy. If these lords grew too powerful, they could pose a threat to the central authority of the Zhou. For now, however, King Wu and his advisors focused on ensuring the loyalty of the newly appointed feudal lords. These men, many of whom had fought alongside the Zhou in the rebellion, were grateful for their new positions of power. But King Wu was wary. He knew that loyalty, though important, could not be taken for granted. He needed to establish a system of checks and balances to ensure that the local lords would not challenge his authority. As King Wu's reign progressed, the Zhou began to lay the foundations for a more just and prosperous society. One of the most significant changes was the implementation of legal reforms. The Shang had been a society governed by arbitrary rules, where the king's will was law. Under the Zhou, however, King Wu sought to create a legal system that was more consistent and fair. He called upon scholars and philosophers to help codify the laws, ensuring that they would be based on moral principles rather than the whims of the ruling class. In addition to legal reforms, King Wu also worked to restore the agriculture of the land. The Shang had drained the countryside of its resources, leaving the people impoverished and hungry. The Zhou, recognizing the importance of agriculture to the stability of the state, focused on rebuilding the land and encouraging agricultural production. They implemented programs to reclaim farmland and encourage the growth of crops, ensuring that the people would have the food they needed to thrive. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of King Wu's reign was his dedication to the moral welfare of his people. Unlike the Shang, who had ruled through fear and oppression, the Zhou sought to lead by example. King Wu, a man of virtue and honor, made it clear that his dynasty would be built on the principles of righteousness, compassion, and justice. He encouraged his ministers and military leaders to act in accordance with these values, creating a government that was not only powerful, but also morally sound. Yet, as with any new dynasty, the Zhou faced challenges from within and without. The remnants of Shang loyalists still lurked in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to restore the old regime. The feudal lords, though loyal for now, had the potential to grow restless, and the young King Wu was still learning the complexities of governance. But despite these challenges, the Zhou were resolute. They had overthrown the Shang, and now they would prove that they could rule justly and wisely. The true test of King Wu's reign would come with the passage of time. Would the Zhou be able to hold on to the mandate of heaven? Or would their rule, too, be overtaken by corruption and tyranny? Only the future would tell. But for now, the people of China, free from the shadows of the Shang, looked to the horizon with hope. The dawn of the Zhou dynasty had arrived, and with it, the possibility of a new and better world. As the Zhou dynasty settled into its newly established rule, the transition from the tyranny of the Shang to the promise of a more just and orderly society seemed to be progressing well. King Wu, alongside his advisors, worked tirelessly to rebuild the foundations of the state, focusing on a blend of legal reforms, economic revival, and moral governance. The people's hopes were high, as they believed that the Zhou had the wisdom and strength to lead them into a golden age. Yet, even as the ashes of the Shang were swept away, there were undercurrents of tension that threatened to unravel the very system that had brought the Zhou to power. The feudal system that had been implemented by King Wu, designed to ensure loyalty and effective governance across the vast territories, began to show cracks. The feudal lords, once eager to gain favor and land from the newly crowned king, soon began to grow restless. In the early years of the Zhou dynasty, King Wu had been a charismatic and unifying figure, a leader of great personal virtue who had captured the hearts of his people. However, as time passed, the realities of ruling a sprawling kingdom began to test his capacity to maintain control over his growing domain. The problem began with the distant regions, far from the capital, where the local lords, empowered by the promise of autonomy and wealth, started to consolidate their power. These lords, now at the head of large territories, had little incentive to adhere to the authority of King Wu. The feudal system, intended to keep them loyal to the king by creating personal bonds of duty, inadvertently gave them the resources and influence they needed to become semi-independent rulers. They controlled vast armies, owned rich lands, and governed their own courts, leaving the Zhou king's influence limited to the heart of the empire. King Wu, though a strong leader, had never intended for the empire to be governed by so many decentralized powers. His original vision of unity began to fray as the feudal lords increasingly sought to advance their own interests. These lords were not bound by the same ideals of justice and virtue that had driven King Wu's rise to power. Instead, they followed their own ambitions, frequently clashing with each other and undermining the fragile peace that had been established in the aftermath of the Shang. Among these lords, one in particular began to rise above the rest, a man named Daji, the ruler of the Eastern Territories. Daji, a former military general under the Shang, had been granted lands and power by King Wu for his contributions to the Zhou rebellion. Initially, Daji had been loyal to the Zhou cause, but as his power grew, so did his ambition. He began to challenge King Wu's central authority, gathering a faction of like-minded feudal lords who sought greater autonomy for their regions. Jizi's influence spread through the eastern lands like wildfire, and soon, he was in a position to rival the king himself. King Wu, although aware of the growing dissent among the lords, was initially slow to respond. He had been focused on the challenges of rebuilding the kingdom and securing his dynasty's legitimacy. Moreover, the Zhou had always prided themselves on their adherence to virtue, and King Wu believed that the feudal lords, though ambitious, would ultimately see the wisdom in staying loyal to the center. However, as Jizi and his allies began to grow in power, it became evident that the Zhou king's vision of a unified empire was in peril. The rivalry between King Wu and Jizi came to a head during a series of diplomatic negotiations that were meant to secure peace between the central Zhou and the rebellious lords. King Wu, ever the diplomat, invited Jizi and his supporters to the capital, hoping to settle the growing tensions with words rather than violence. The court in the capital, still filled with the symbols of the Zhou victory over the Shang, was an impressive setting for such an important negotiation. But what was supposed to be a diplomatic affair quickly turned into a display of rivalry and mistrust. As Jizi entered the capital with his entourage, it became clear that he did not come in peace. His manner was defiant, his eyes filled with the same ambition that had once driven the Shang rulers. Jizi openly criticized King Wu's methods, accusing him of weakening the Zhou by clinging too tightly to centralized power. The argument, though formal on the surface, quickly became heated. It was not just a discussion about governance, it was a power struggle. Jizi made no attempt to hide his desire for more influence, challenging the legitimacy of King Wu's control over the empire. King Wu, though taken aback by Jizi's brazen challenge, responded with the same composure that had marked his rise. He reminded Jizi that the Zhou had defeated the Shang not to recreate a fractured and chaotic system, but to build a strong and unified empire. He warned that any attempt to undermine the Zhou's central authority would only lead to ruin. But his words, though wise, fell on deaf ears. The tension between the two men escalated quickly. Jizi's supporters began to gather in the court, openly challenging the king's decisions. The once unified Zhou court was now divided into factions, with Jizi and his allies on one side, and King Wu's loyalists on the other. The kingdom that had been forged in the fires of rebellion was now on the brink of a new conflict, one that threatened to undo the progress made since the fall of the Shang. Behind the scenes, Daji's influence, though she was long gone, still cast a shadow over the Zhou dynasty. The seeds of division had been planted long before the fall of the Shang. During the days of corruption and excess in the palace, the Zhou, in their pursuit of justice, had failed to recognize the dangers of their own power struggles. Like the Shang before them, they had become entangled in a web of competing ambitions, and it was no longer clear who would come out victorious. As King Wu faced the growing threat from Jizi and the rebellious lords, he knew that he had only one option left. He would need to consolidate his power and restore order. But doing so would require significant sacrifices. The feudal system, once seen as the key to unity, had become the very thing that was tearing the empire apart. The seeds of division had taken root, and the once glorious dream of a unified Zhou dynasty was now in danger of unraveling. King Wu's response to the challenge would set the tone for the future of the Zhou dynasty. Would he be able to maintain his authority and restore the unity that had made the Zhou such a powerful force? Or would the internal divisions destroy the empire from within? The Zhou dynasty, still fresh from its victory over the Shang, had entered a phase of disillusionment. The unity that had once defined King Wu's leadership was now eroding, replaced by a deepening divide between the central government and the feudal lords. King Wu had set out with noble intentions to create a dynasty built on justice, virtue, and the collective good, but the power of the feudal lords had grown too great to be ignored. King Wu's reign, once filled with promise, was now threatened by the very system he had put in place. Jizi, once a loyal supporter of King Wu, had become his most formidable adversary. His ambitious vision for the Zhou Empire had grown beyond what the king was willing to allow. Daji was a man who understood the importance of power. He had seen how the decentralization of the empire's authority had given rise to his own influence. And now, he believed that he could wield that power for himself, potentially at the expense of the king. His challenge to King Wu's authority had been a turning point in the empire's history. As the tensions between the two factions reached a boiling point, King Wu's health began to decline. The pressures of ruling a fractious empire, the endless battles with rebellious lords, and the constant threat of internal division weighed heavily on the once vibrant king. His advisors, including Tai Gong Wang, urged him to take action against Daji and the other rebellious lords. But King Wu hesitated. He had always believed that dialogue and diplomacy would be enough to quell dissent. But now, as his health faltered, he began to realize that he could no longer afford such leniency. Daji, sensing the king's vulnerability, began to act more boldly. His faction gained strength, and more feudal lords, once loyal to King Wu, joined his cause. It became clear that King Wu was losing his grip on the empire he had worked so hard to build. As his condition worsened, his authority began to wane. The capital, once a symbol of Zhou unity, became the center of intrigue and backstabbing. Courtiers and generals aligned themselves with Daji, seeing in him the future of the Zhou Dynasty. Despite his failing health, King Wu made one last attempt to restore order. He summoned Daji to the capital, hoping that a direct confrontation would settle the matter once and for all. But when Daji arrived, it was clear that he had come with no intention of reconciling. The once loyal general had become a rival, and his ambitions had outgrown his loyalty to the Zhou crown. The two men faced each other in the royal court, their eyes locked in a battle of wills. King Wu, though weak, still carried the weight of his authority. He demanded that Daji submit to his rule and pledge loyalty to the Zhou dynasty. Daji, however, was no longer interested in submitting to anyone. He had already gathered enough power to defy the king without fear of reprisal. What you seek, King Wu, is a kingdom built on ideals and dreams, Daji said, his voice cold and calculating. But ideals alone cannot hold an empire together. What I offer is something more practical, an empire built on strength, loyalty, and the realities of power. King Wu, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and regret, responded, "You speak of power, Daji, but power without justice is tyranny. We fought to overthrow the Shang to create a better world, not to build a new dynasty on the same foundations of oppression." Daji smiled, his expression one of cold resolve. The world has changed, King Wu. The people no longer care about your lofty ideals. They want stability, they want prosperity, and they want a ruler who can deliver that. And I will. The confrontation marked the beginning of the end for King Wu's reign. Despite his best efforts, he could not stem the tide of rebellion that was sweeping through his empire. The lords who had once pledged loyalty to him were now rallying behind Daji, whose promises of power and security resonated with their desires for greater autonomy. King Wu's once unified court had fractured, and there was no turning back. In the final days of his life, King Wu withdrew from the court, his health deteriorating rapidly. He spent his remaining hours in contemplation, reflecting on the choices he had made and the empire he had tried to build. He had hoped to create a dynasty that would endure, but now it seemed as though that hope had been dashed by the very forces he had tried to control. King Wu passed away quietly in his bed, leaving behind a divided empire and a legacy tarnished by the rise of Daji. The death of the king marked a turning point in Zhou history. Without King Wu's unifying vision, the empire began to crumble. Daji, now the most powerful man in the Zhou, was poised to take control of the kingdom, but his ascent would not come without cost. The Zhou dynasty, born from rebellion and the overthrow of the Shang, was now at a crossroads. Would Daji's rule bring the stability he promised? Or would it mark the beginning of another cycle of corruption and decay? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the era of King Wu, the visionary leader who had sought to build a just and prosperous dynasty, was over. King Wu's death had set in motion the inevitable. His carefully constructed empire began to dissolve in the wake of his absence. The once unified Zhou court was now a battleground of competing factions, each struggling for power in the void left by the king's passing. Yet, among the feudal lords, one figure stood tall: Daji. The ambitious general who had once sworn loyalty to King Wu now found himself in a position of unprecedented power. With King Wu's death, the monarchy had been rendered weak and fragmented, and Daji, ever the opportunist, moved quickly to solidify his control over the empire. As Daji assumed his role as the de facto ruler of the Zhou Dynasty, his rise was marked by a blend of ruthless pragmatism and calculated diplomacy. He knew that to hold the throne, he needed not only the loyalty of the feudal lords, but also the support of the people. The promises of prosperity and stability that he had made during his rivalry with King Wu had resonated with many of the regional lords. But now, Daji needed to deliver on them. He set about consolidating his rule, seizing control of the capital and ensuring that the feudal lords swore their allegiance to him. Yet, for all his calculated moves, Daji's rise was not without resistance. The ideals that King Wu had espoused, the dreams of a just and virtuous kingdom, still lingered in the hearts of many. Among those who opposed Daji's ascension was Gao Xian, a respected scholar and former advisor to King Wu. Gao Xian had been a staunch believer in the vision of a morally righteous Zhou dynasty, one that would not be ruled by raw power and ambition, but by principles of justice and the will of the people. With King Wu's death, Gao Xian had seen the disintegration of that dream, yet he refused to accept that the Zhou could be ruled by someone like Daji. Gao Xian gathered a faction of like-minded individuals, including former allies of King Wu, who shared his belief in the Zhou's original ideals. Together, they began to organize a resistance against Daji's rule, calling for a return to the values of the Zhou's founding. They argued that the Zhou had been founded not just on military strength, but on a moral and just mandate to govern. To them, Daji's rise to power was a betrayal of everything King Wu had stood for. Meanwhile, Daji, aware of the growing opposition, moved swiftly to eliminate any threats to his rule. His strategy was simple: divide and conquer. He made concessions to some of the feudal lords, promising them autonomy and wealth in exchange for their loyalty. He ruthlessly eliminated anyone who dared challenge him, including some of his former allies who had turned against him. His regime, though marked by the promise of stability, became increasingly authoritarian. The ideals of justice and virtue that King Wu had worked so hard to uphold were gradually lost in the pursuit of power. One of Daji's first actions as ruler was to dismantle the reforms that King Wu had put in place. The legal system, designed to ensure fairness and equity, was gradually corrupted, while Daji's rule brought an initial sense of order to the chaos. It quickly became clear that his vision for the empire was one built on the consolidation of personal power. The centralized authority of the Zhou was replaced by a more autocratic rule that focused on maintaining control over the regional lords, rather than serving the interests of the common people. Despite his iron grip on power, Daji's rule was not as stable as he had hoped. The resistance led by Gao Xian grew in strength, fueled by the dissatisfaction of those who saw the new regime as a betrayal of the Zhou's founding principles. Gao Xian's faction began to rally support from the common people, who had grown disillusioned with Daji's rule. His promises of prosperity had not been fully realized, and the heavy taxes levied on the people to maintain Daji's military campaigns had only worsened their suffering. The tension between Daji's government and the resistance reached a breaking point when Gao Xian's forces, bolstered by loyalists and peasant militias, launched a rebellion against Daji's regime. The rebellion was a symbol of the growing frustration among the people, who had once placed their hope in the Zhou dynasty's ideals. only to see those ideals crushed under the weight of power and ambition. The final battle between Jizi's forces and Gao Xian's rebellion would determine the future of the Zhou dynasty. It was fought in the northern plains, where both armies, exhausted from years of conflict, met in a decisive clash. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Yet, despite Jizi's military expertise, it became clear that the people, rallying behind the ideals of King Wu's vision, had more than just the will to fight, they had the moral high ground. In the end, it was Gao Xian's forces that triumphed. Jizi, seeing his army faltering and his reign on the brink of collapse, attempted to flee, but he was captured by the rebels. His fate was sealed, and the last remnants of his power crumbled before the will of those who had fought for the Zhou's original vision. With Jizi's defeat, the Zhou dynasty entered a period of turmoil. Gao Xian, while victorious, was faced with the daunting task of rebuilding the fractured empire. The Zhou, once founded on the ideals of virtue, justice, and the mandate of heaven, had become a shell of its former self. The dreams of King Wu had been dashed by the internal strife that had engulfed the empire. Now, it was up to Gao Xian and the remaining leaders of the Zhou to try to restore some semblance of order. However, the damage had been done. The Zhou dynasty, weakened by infighting, corruption, and the betrayal of its founding ideals, could never fully recover. Jizi's rise to power had been the final blow to the dreams of a unified and just empire. The Zhou had become yet another example of how power, once achieved, could corrupt even the noblest of ideals. As Gao Xian began the arduous task of restoring some semblance of order, he realized that the future of the Zhou was uncertain. The once great dynasty, born from rebellion and the overthrow of the Shang, had now become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of political unity. The mandate of heaven, once a guiding principle for the Zhou, had been lost to history, and with it, the hope for a dynasty that would truly fulfill the promises of King Wu's vision. With the fall of Jizi and the defeat of his forces, the Zhou dynasty entered its final phase, a period marked by fragmentation, internal conflict, and the unraveling of the very ideals upon which it had been built. The death of King Wu, the rise of Jizi, and the eventual rebellion that overthrew his autocratic regime had laid bare the inherent weaknesses in the Zhou system. Now, the people were left to pick up the pieces of a broken empire, uncertain of what the future held. After Jizi's capture and execution, the leadership of the Zhou was left in disarray. Gao Xian, the former scholar and leader of the rebellion, found himself in a position of great power. Despite the triumph of his forces, he was well aware of the fragility of his position. His victory was hollow, for it had come at the cost of a once unified dynasty. Gao Xian, having witnessed the rise and fall of both King Wu and Jizi, understood that the foundation of the Zhou dynasty had been eroded beyond repair. His first task was to stabilize the realm, but doing so meant navigating a fractured political landscape, one filled with competing factions and vested interests. The once powerful feudal lords, who had pledged loyalty to King Wu and fought for their own autonomy under Jizi, now turned on each other in a desperate scramble for control. In the aftermath of Jizi's defeat, the empire splintered further into smaller states, each with its own ambitions. The Zhou capital, once the heart of the empire, became a shadow of its former self, a place of intrigue and betrayal. Gao Xian, unable to unite the feuding lords, was forced to adopt a policy of appeasement, granting them greater autonomy in exchange for nominal allegiance. It was a fragile peace, one that barely held the empire together. The people, who had once believed in the promise of the Zhou dynasty, a kingdom built on virtue, justice, and the mandate of heaven, began to lose hope. They had seen too many betrayals, too many broken promises. King Wu's dream of a just and prosperous dynasty had long since been shattered, and Jizi's rise to power had only reinforced the idea that ambition, not virtue, was the true currency of rule. The common people, burdened by heavy taxes and the instability of constant conflict, began to question whether the Zhou could ever be restored to its former glory. As the years passed, the Zhou court became increasingly irrelevant. The feudal lords, now more powerful than ever, began to act independently, with little regard for the central authority. Gao Xian, though still nominally in charge, was powerless to stop the disintegration of the dynasty. The feudal lords raised their own armies, waged wars among themselves, and pursued their own interests, leaving the Zhou Empire a fragmented and weak shell of its former self. The final blow to the Zhou came when the state of Qin, a growing power to the west, saw the weakness of the Zhou as an opportunity. Under the leadership of Duke Xiao and his brilliant strategist, Han Fizi, the Qin began to expand rapidly. The Zhou, already fragmented and weakened by internal strife, could offer no meaningful resistance. The Qin army, efficient and ruthless, swept through the Zhou territories, conquering city after city. Gao Xian, who had once hoped to restore the Zhou's ideals, was now powerless to stop the tide of Qin aggression. The fall of the Zhou dynasty came swiftly, in a final, desperate attempt to save what remained of the empire. Gao Xian appealed to the remaining feudal lords for support, but the loyalty that once bound the lords to the Zhou had long since vanished. The feudal lords, now more concerned with their own survival, abandoned the Zhou cause. Gao Xian, realizing that the empire was beyond saving, withdrew from the court and retreated to the countryside, where he lived out his remaining days in relative obscurity. The Qin forces eventually reached the Zhou capital, where they met no meaningful resistance. The last vestiges of the Zhou dynasty crumbled before the might of the Qin. The ancient capital, once a symbol of the Zhou's power and unity, was looted and burned. The imperial family, the last of the Zhou rulers, was either executed or forced into exile. The mandate of heaven, which had once justified the Zhou's rule, was now lost, and with it, the hope of a unified, just empire. The fall of the Zhou dynasty marked the end of an era. The Zhou had been born from rebellion, rising up against the Shang with the promise of a better, more just world. But over time, that promise had been corrupted by ambition, division, and internal strife. The legacy of King Wu, the visionary leader who had dreamed of a virtuous kingdom, was all but forgotten. The ideals of the Zhou, justice, virtue, and the mandate of heaven, had been trampled under the weight of power struggles and human ambition. The Qin, now the dominant power in China, would go on to establish the Qin dynasty, which would bring about the first unified empire in Chinese history. But the Qin, though successful in their military conquests, were not immune to the same forces that had destroyed the Zhou. The rise of the Qin marked the beginning of a new chapter in Chinese history, one characterized by ruthless centralization, legalism, and the harsh rule of the emperor. For the Zhou, there was no redemption. Their dream of a just and unified empire had come to an end. The story of Daji, of King Zhou, and of the rise and fall of the Zhou dynasty became a cautionary tale, one of ambition, betrayal, and the fragility of power. The Zhou may have failed, but their legacy would live on in the lessons they left behind: the dangers of unchecked power, the fleeting nature of human ambition, and the impossibility of building a just empire on the foundations of corruption and cruelty. And so, the mandate of heaven passed once more, but the dream of a unified, just kingdom, first promised by King Wu, remained an elusive ideal, a vision that would not be realized for centuries to come.